Thank you everyone for coming along today. Just by way of introduction, because I'm sure not too many people know me, I work for CLSA. We're a leading global equity broker and investment banking operation. We've always had a very strong research team across the globe. I've been at the company for a long, long time. I was a consumer analyst for many, many years. And then in the last couple of years, I've focused pretty much exclusively on e-commerce. So prior to this year, I was focused exclusively on the Chinese e-commerce market. I know the Chinese e-commerce pretty well, which has been quite useful in putting the ASEAN e-commerce market into context. Now you'll see on my name card just says consultant. Actually, what that really means is I'm just a part-time analyst. I switched to a part-time role a couple of years ago. The main reason for that is that I actually have a totally separate career in something completely different. Actually a bit more, this is interesting stuff, but my other career is a lot more exciting. I'm actually a professional wildlife photographer. So feel free to ask me about that as well. But what I wanted to talk about was a big new report, which actually just came out yesterday. It's 550 pages. I've spent really the last couple of months deeply immersed in this project. And this report looks at e-commerce across ASEAN, but really with a focus on the four big markets, so Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And it looks at the current state of e-commerce in those markets and the prospects for e-commerce in each of those four markets. So that's just a brief summary of what's in the report. I would say that pretty much all the research for this project is proprietary. So for instance, I went and visited more than 50 companies around the region. Most of those are privately held companies, not easy to get in to see. We did a survey of 600 online shoppers in each of those four markets. And then probably most interestingly, we did a lot of on-the-ground online shopping in each of these four markets. There were some pretty interesting findings there. You've really got to go and test out all the sites to really have a feel for how they work, or as we found in some cases, don't really work. Now I'm obviously conscious of the time, so I don't have a lot of time to talk. So I just want to kind of leave you with some of the main sound bites from this report. So the first thing is online retail is underpenetrated in ASEAN. ASEAN has about 8% of the global population, 3% of global GDP, but only about 0.5% of global online retail sales. So there's still a lot of room for growth. When I've met commentators in doing this report around the region, everyone's told me when I go to each market, how much does online retail account for as a percentage of total retail sales? Most people typically tell me, and a lot of the independent data sources I've seen typically put the figure at somewhere between 0.5 to 1%. I think that's a gross understatement of the true picture. And the reason it's a gross understatement is that people are not including the C2c markets. And the C2c markets in ASEAN are huge. Particularly in Thailand and Indonesia, we estimate that the C2c markets are as much as 70% of the online retail market. So what I'm talking about here is first of all, you've got some formal C2c sites, such as Tokopedia in Indonesia, We Love Shopping in Thailand. Then you've got a lot of these classified ad sites, such as OLX or Kaskus in Indonesia, which have added a C2C component in recent years. And then thirdly, you've got a lot of e-commerce that's taking place on what I would call, or it's informal e-commerce on social media. So these are on sites like Facebook, Instagram, Line. There is a lot going on in terms of those informal channels. Now, I would say The C2c markets being bigger than the B2C markets, that's very common in emerging markets. If you look at nearly all markets, the way they typically develop, you start with a big C2C market, and then over time, the B2C market becomes much bigger. That's what happened in the US. It's exactly what's happened in China. I expect the same thing to happen in ASEAN. So the B2C markets generally are growing at a much faster clip than the C2C markets. So I think the biggest takeaway from this report, I would say that if I look at the 4 markets we've looked at, Indonesia, e-commerce in Indonesia is going to be huge. Thailand, I think it's going to be quite big. The Philippines, although I've got reasonable growth there, I think the problem for the Philippines is just really too early. Incomes are still too low. The supporting infrastructure just isn't really there. And unfortunately for Malaysia, as if it didn't have enough problems already, Malaysia is the market I'm probably least enthusiastic about. Some of it's its own fault, some of it's not its fault. I mean, the obvious area where it's handicapped, the market's just too small. It's not going to get the same level of domestic and particularly foreign participation and capital as some of those other markets. So this just gives you some idea of where online retail sales per capita are. So you can see in all those 4 ASEAN markets, we're expecting some big increases, particularly in Indonesia and Thailand. So the blue bars are 2014, the yellow bars where we think things will be in 2019. So even though we're expecting some big increases in some of those numbers, they still, even in 2019, are still a long way below the figures in 2014 in terms of where China and the US is. So they're still a long way off those numbers. Now, if you look at online retail sales as a percentage of total retail sales, as I said, most of the commentators and the statistics I read puts the numbers at, as I said, 0.5 to 1% at the moment. As I said, I think that's a gross understatement. In Thailand, which I think is the most developed of the online retail markets in ASEAN at the moment, we think the figure is 3.9%. Malaysia actually is reasonably developed, 2.2%. Indonesia, 2.4%. But you can see there in 2019, we think in Indonesia, online retail sales could be up to as much as almost 11% of total retail sales. Now, before people jump up and say I'm barking mad here, it is important to note that the definition we're using of retail sales is quite a narrow definition. So for instance, it doesn't include autos, auto parts, doesn't include retail sales of gasoline, restaurant or hotel sales, and of course it doesn't include the unorganized sector. So it doesn't include any business that's either unlicensed or not paying tax. I think part of the reason for stripping all those things out is it makes for a more apples to apples comparison, because I don't think a lot of those segments are that vulnerable to e-commerce. So there's a big focus in the report on the key drivers and obstacles for growth going forward. And rather than sort of go through all of these, why don't I jump ahead to some of the charts? So this is a very important chart in my view. So what you've got on the bottom axis, you've got GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis. I think that's quite a good proxy for incomes. And then on the left-hand side, you've got B2C online retail spending per capita. And what we've done here, I think we've taken 50 or 60 markets around the world, and we've got 6 years of historic data, which for some of them we've circled. And then you can use statistical software to create what we call a curve of best fit. So this is quite interesting for the ASEAN countries, and I'll point to 2 in particular. So what tends to happen globally, you can see that B2C per capita spending tends to lift off when incomes get to hit the $10,000 US mark. Now, what's good about Indonesia, and one of the reasons I'm bullish about Indonesia is right on that threshold level at the moment. This is one of the problems for Malaysia. Malaysia crossed that threshold level several years ago, and we haven't seen any liftoff in e-commerce. Social media. Social media is huge in ASEAN. Maybe a surprise for people to know that if you take the big ASEAN countries combined, there are more Facebook users in ASEAN than there are in the US. If you look at some of those numbers here, you know, in Thailand, for instance, you've got 60% of the population aged over 14 with Facebook accounts. Similar percentage for Line. One of the good things about Malaysia is it's unbelievable. 71% of the population over the age of 14 has a Facebook account. So just to put those numbers into perspective, people always talk about China and social media and how engaged Chinese consumers are with social media. The corresponding percentage for WeChat, it's only 48%. 48% of the population over the age of 14 are WeChat users. And I think social media, the reason social media is important for e-commerce is that if you're a user of social media, I think you are demonstrating some degree of internet literacy. And more importantly, given that most of social media is accessed through mobile devices, you're demonstrating some sort of level of mobile internet literacy. And I think that is quite an important stepping stone to shopping online. Now, mobile shopping, mobile devices will really be the big driver of online shopping in ASEAN. In China, for instance, you've got actually pretty high levels of installed PC penetration and fixed line broadband penetration. In most of the ASEAN markets, those levels are very, very low. So you're going to be reliant on mobile devices as the key online retail enabler. So what this chart shows you, it's similar to the other one. On the bottom axis, you've got mobile internet penetration, and then on the other axis, you've got B2C online shopping per capita. And the key number there is that globally, when mobile internet penetration gets to 35%, that tends to be the level at which B2C online spending takes off. Again, another reason why I'm bullish about Indonesia. Indonesia is right at that level. One of the problems I've got with Thailand, and I'm generally still fairly bullish on Thailand, is that Thailand crossed that level quite a long time ago. What is good about Thailand is actually in the last 3 years, we have started to see quite a big acceleration in B2C online shopping growth. So there may be a delayed reaction in Thailand. So online payment, this is obviously a big topic as far as online shopping is concerned. I'd say it's really, really important in Indonesia and the Philippines. And it's a particular challenge in those markets simply because bank account and credit card penetration is so low. So if you look across there, you can see that in Indonesia and the Philippines, you've only got roughly a third of the adult population with bank accounts. And then if you go to the end column, you can see that credit card penetration is only a couple of %. That obviously poses particular challenges for online retailers. I mean, the main thing it means is those markets are going to be very heavily reliant on cash and delivery as a payment option. And one of the things we see throughout ASEAN is that not all online retailers are offering cash and delivery as a payment option. Not all of the express delivery companies are accepting cash on delivery. That is beginning to change, I would say. I'm definitely seeing some progress. And if you speak to online retailers about things like cash receivables, those numbers are definitely coming down. You know, we're starting to see some factoring being entered into with the banks and the logistics companies and online retailers. I think the other thing that I think needs to happen, it hasn't got a lot of traction yet, and that is basically the development of mobile payment apps that are not reliant on bank accounts or credit cards. So in a number of the ASEAN countries, we've got the telcos. A lot of the telcos have introduced mobile payment apps. I don't know if any of you have traveled to Kenya, but Kenya has this incredibly successful mobile payment app called M-Pesa. And it basically just allows the SIM card to function as a mini debit card. And you can hand over cash, usually at physical retail outlets, at telecom outlets, and you can get credit added to your SIM card, and that can be used to pay for goods and services, can be used to transfer money, pay for bills. There are quite a lot of those platforms that are springing up in ASEAN, but I would say I don't see any of them at the moment have gotten any real traction, but it would be a big enabler if one or two of them could. One of the other reasons I'm so bullish about Indonesia is that Indonesia has received more private equity and direct equity than the other three Asian markets combined. And you can see on the right-hand chart, the blue bars are Indonesia, the light blue bars are Indonesia, a very, very clear pattern of deal flow acceleration. And what that demonstrates, I think it demonstrates a couple of things. It demonstrates professional investor confidence in the prospects for online retail and internet generally in those markets. And obviously, the more capital that can come into the sector, you know, the more players there are going to be, the more SKU online, the more companies will be able to spend on marketing, on mobile development, on logistics. All of those things help to propel the industry going forward. This is obviously, for me, it's obviously a problem in the Philippines, is getting very little private equity funding at the moment, and that's holding back development of the industry. I'll just finish off here. I'll just finish off and I'll leave a bit of time for questions. But I used to be a consumer analyst, so I used to follow a lot of offline retailers. But what tends to happen when online retail comes along in a market, there is disruption. And the first segment that's always hit are the offline retailers. We certainly saw that in China, where the offline retailers were, many segments were just devastated. So what happens is, in a very short period of time, suddenly there is a big new channel of competition for the offline segment. And what tends to happen is online sales cannibalize offline sales. The other point, and we've had a good look at this, is that prices online tend to be lower than offline. That immediately puts pressure on offline retailers to lower prices. That in turn puts pressure on margins. When I was an analyst covering China retailers back in 2007, 2008, 2009, all the offline retailers used to tell me, they all used to talk about, the big store opening opportunity in lower tier cities in China. Having seen ASEAN offline retailers, they're talking the exact same thing. I would be very, very careful about that, because once online retail gets into these smaller towns and cities, and in China it happened very, very quickly, that store opening opportunity can very quickly evaporate. So if you looked at the Chinese retailers back in 2007, 2008, 2009, when they were all talking about the big store opening opportunities, by 2012, most of the big chains were in net store closure mode. So I'd be wary about offline retailers in ASEAN that are still talking about big store opening opportunities. The other one here, profit focus can be a disadvantage. So one of the things we see, particularly with the Rocket Internet group of companies, is that they spend a lot. They spend a lot on marketing, spend a lot on logistics, a lot on traffic acquisition. And to some extent, that puts offline retailers that set up an online operation at a disadvantage because they're always going to have one eye on the bottom line. Some of these pure online operators that are well-funded aren't really paying a lot of attention right now to the bottom line. And I think that puts them at an advantage in terms of traffic acquisition and in terms of SKU build-out. Now, I would say in Indonesia and Thailand in particular, the offline retailers have been more proactive with their online initiatives versus peers in China as of a couple of years ago. But I think, and that's commendable, but the problem with that is if you actually go and look at each of these online initiatives that they've set up, in almost every case, I would say those online initiatives actually represent competition to the offline operations. So I think it's inevitable there will be some cannibalization of the more profitable offline operations. And the other thing is these new online operations almost certainly will be loss-making for at least the next 2 years. I haven't, a big challenge for all the offline retailers is, can they turn themselves into omni-channel retailers? Can they successfully integrate their offline and online operations? It sounds simple in theory. It's very, very complex. If you look at the best of the omni-channel retailers in the US, such as Urban Outfitters, The Gap, or Nordstrom, it took them 7-8 years to get things right, so it's a big challenge. And the last thing I would say, I call it the China Hangover, because for public equity investors, what happened in China, the decimation of offline retailers there, is still very fresh in their minds. So that, I think, we've got a bit more, one more slide. So this just shows you for listed offline retailers in ASEAN versus China. It shows you that on the left-hand bars, it shows you that EBITDA margins are roughly 50% higher in ASEAN. It shows you that returns on capital are almost double. And what's gone on in ASEAN is that offline retailers have operated in what I would describe as quite a cozy competitive environment. The development of online retailing is cracking that all open. So, I think there will be pressure on margins and returns on capital at offline retailers. Okay, why don't I leave it at that? I don't know if anyone would like to ask me any questions. Anyone got any questions they'd like to? I mean, they can ask me now or they can ask me later, but yeah. Sorry? Well, if you're a paying client, you will definitely have it already. If you're really nice to me, I might be able to. I could probably send you a hard copy. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I started this report. I mean, I've worked on it on and off. I started this report, I think, back in February. It was just. I mean, what I've said to everyone, if I do a follow-up report, we'll include Vietnam next year. And it was really just a question of how many markets can I cover. I mean, I've done 550 pages for 4 markets. If I start adding more markets, it would just got crazy. Yeah.
Any more questions? All right, we're going to pass the mic to you. Hold on, the mic is just right behind you.
Hello.
Hi.
So I have a quick question on industries for e-commerce.
Yep.
So for the really, like the countries where you see really high penetration of e-commerce, such as China, Indonesia, are there specific types of e-commerce that are more successful than others, that are more prone to digital payments? So do you look at online marketplaces versus, let's say, groceries versus fashion, so on and so forth?
Yeah. So, I mean, the model that can completely, if you're talking about products, okay, consumer products, the model that completely dominates in China is the marketplace platform. So the marketplace platform has almost a 90% share in China. And I think the way that ASEAN will develop will probably be not that dissimilar to China. So what you've got in ASEAN is you've got a few marketplace-only operators, but most companies typically start out with a first-party sales model. They need to do that because that's the way you can build SKUs. It's the way that you can have much better control over the whole consumer experience. But I think once they've built a critical mass with the first-party model, almost every company will look to add a marketplace. It's very, very difficult to run a first-party model only and be profitable. There's very few examples of that in ASEAN. So I think the path of evolution in ASEAN will probably be broadly similar to China. In terms of the products that get sold online, again, I think it'll be very similar to China. Apparel and footwear will be the single biggest category. Consumer electronics and appliances, the number 2 category. That's actually already pretty much happened. I mean, in terms of other potential big categories, groceries is obviously the big other category out there. Can groceries go online? It hasn't happened globally. There's been very few success stories with groceries globally. If you're talking about non-fresh groceries, China's seeing quite a lot of traction on that front. I think there is a market for that type of product online, much more difficult for fresh.